entire Canadian delegation to our Malaysian hosts, particularly Dr. Ibrahim, the Prime Minister, for an extraordinary group of meetings, extraordinary hospitality, which is going to continue for the next few hours this evening.
Imagine the summit hall in Kuala Lumpur, cameras flash, applause rings out, and appearing on the red carpet is not the American president, not the Chinese premier, but the leader of Canada. What happens next is something that many in Washington could not have imagined. Asia welcomes Canada as a new strategic partner, not just a guest, but a participant capable of changing the balance of power on the continent. While America builds trade walls, Canada opens its doors.
Just before I start, I would like to just pass on my appreciation of the...
While the White House talks about tariffs and threats, Ottawa signs contracts and strengthens ties with the fastest growing economies on the planet. The story is not just about diplomatic success. It is a story about a turnaround that could define the 21st century. While the United States, led by Donald Trump, is imposing new tariffs and talking about fair trade, Canada is betting on cooperation, technology, and clean energy. While Washington argues about who's to blame for the decline in exports, Canada is quietly preparing the largest economic maneuver in the country's history, the creation of a multi-billion-dollar Asian trade corridor. In Kuala Lumpur, the Canadian leader is welcomed as a symbol of stability. For Asia, he is a new voice, unburdened by old hegemony. For the West, he is a signal.
From our perspective, a highly productive few days at the ASEAN summit here in Kuala Lumpur. I've been joined by a delegation, including our Minister of International Trade, and we have focused on building new partnerships and unlocking new economic opportunities.
In a world where old alliances are crumbling, new centers of power are emerging. And if Ottawa used to look like a junior partner to the U.S., it is now becoming a mediator between East and West, connecting resources, technology, and energy. Behind the beautiful diplomatic phrases lies a simple reality. Canada is tired of waiting for America to stop wavering. It has chosen to act. Against the backdrop of this shift, the scene in Washington looks different. The cameras show President Trump, confident, loud, but increasingly isolated.
Le système de commerce mondial est en train de changer de manière fondamentale. L'évolution technologique et la transition énergétique s'accélèrent à un rythme sans précédent.
His speeches are full of figures that do not match the reports of economic agencies, statements that are not supported by facts. He talks about triumph, but the markets react differently. Manufacturers complain about rising costs, car factories about delivery delays, and analysts increasingly write that tariff policy is hurting the United States itself. Next to him, the Canadian Prime Minister speaks calmly, with figures and facts. And in this silence, in this restraint, there is a new strength. While America is closing doors, Canada is opening new ones. Its exports to Asia are growing, investments are flowing in the opposite direction, and the world media are already calling it a diplomatic breakthrough. But the main thing is not the numbers. The main thing is that for the first time in decades, Canada is no longer playing second fiddle. It is no longer waiting for Washington to give it permission to act. In a world where global rules are being rewritten.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
On the fly, Ottawa is setting an example of how a medium-sized country can play big. This is not just a story about trade. It is a story about a changing world order, about new confidence, and about how silence and strategy can trump loud slogans. Canada is no longer following. It is leading. When Mark Carney stepped off the plane onto the warm tarmac in Kuala Lumpur, no one expected that moment to symbolize the beginning of a new era for Canada. Television cameras from around the world captured his every move. Representatives of ASEAN countries, from Singapore to Indonesia, stood up to greet a leader whose name had, until recently, been associated more with international financial institutions than with world politics. But now, everything has changed. For the first time in decades, it was Ottawa, not Washington, that was the center of attention in the summit hall. And this attention was not just curiosity, it was filled with expectation. Asia had long been looking for a new partner, and it seemed to have finally found one. For many observers, this moment looked almost like a diplomatic coup. Just a few years ago, Canada was seen as a reliable but secondary ally of the U.S.
that will benefit Canadian workers and their businesses. Nous sommes réunis ici à un moment à la fois crucial et rempli d'opportunités. Le monde est devenu plus dangereux et divisé.
A country that followed in the wake of American policy. However, the events of recent years have turned everything upside down. Under pressure from tariffs, threats, and the unpredictability of the White House, Ottawa did what no one expected. Instead of asking for concessions, it began to act independently. According to sources in the Canadian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, preparations for the Asian pivot had been underway for over a year. But it was the trade conflicts with the U.S. that accelerated the launch of the program, known internally as Pacific Reconnect. This plan included not only trade, but also strategic investments in energy infrastructure, digital technologies, and climate projects capable of strengthening ties with the Indo-Pacific region. At the summit in Malaysia, Carney presented a project that many in the press dubbed the $300 billion challenge. Its goal was to increase non-U.S. exports by 50% over the next 10 years, primarily through cooperation with Asia. By comparison, in 2024, about 75% of Canadian exports were still going to the U.S., making the economy vulnerable to any changes in American policy. The new strategy assumed that by 2035,
L'ordre mondial est revenu. Et même si le Canada a prospéré dans ce système, nous savons que la nostalgie n'est pas une stratégie. C'est pourquoi nous traçons une nouvelle voie à suivre pour notre pays.
the share of Asian markets would exceed that of the U.S. The project involved not only government officials, but also representatives of the private sector, from energy corporations to startups, engaged in artificial intelligence and the processing of rare earth minerals. Within the summit itself, reaction to the Canadian initiative was almost enthusiastic. The Jakarta Globe newspaper wrote that Canada came not with speeches, but with proposals. Ottawa proposed creating a joint $15 billion fund to invest in green energy and digital security in the region. Several ASEAN countries expressed their willingness to join the project, calling it an alternative to Chinese loans and American promises. Even Singapore, known for its caution, sent a delegation to negotiate possible technology exchanges with Canadian companies specializing in quantum computing and neural network solutions for energy. This diplomatic energy did not come out of nowhere. Back in early 2025, analysts warned that the U.S. America First policy risked leaving allies without alternatives. But for Canada, this became an opportunity. A country with a strong financial system, stable institutions, and an almost entirely clean energy grid was exactly what the region, tired of its dependence on hydrocarbons and the dollar, needed. Unlike the U.S., Canada did not dictate terms, but offered an exchange. Knowledge for resources, technology for markets. In essence, it went where America could no longer or did not want to go. At one of the summit's closed-door meetings, according to sources close to the Canadian delegation, Carney said a simple phrase: "We're not looking for confrontation. We are looking for room to grow."
On November 4th, our government will table the first federal budget, our first federal budget. And that'll be our plan to protect our communities, our borders, our way of life. Our plan to build a stronger economy where everyone has a chance to get ahead. And our plan to empower Canadians with new opportunities, better careers, and a lower cost of living. Central to those missions.
These words instantly spread through the Asian media because they contrasted with the rhetoric of the White House, where Trump spoke of fairness through strength, Carney spoke of trust through cooperation. For the first time in a long time, the word Canada sounded like a synonym for stability in Asian political discourse. But the success in Kuala Lumpur was not only symbolic. According to Global Affairs Canada, in the first 3 months after the summit, 8 memoranda of understanding were signed with Asian countries in the fields of energy, technology, and education. One of them, an agreement with South Korea to build a joint research center for small nuclear reactors, was a breakthrough for Canadian technology exports. It's estimated that this project could create up to 20,000 new jobs in Alberta and British Columbia and attract over $10 billion as an investment. Another agreement, this time with Vietnam, concerns the supply of critical minerals, including nickel and lithium, which are components necessary for the production of batteries. This agreement marked the first time that Asia would purchase raw materials directly from Canada, bypassing intermediaries from the U.S. The reaction in Washington was predictable, but nervous. The American media reported that the Trump administration was considering imposing additional tariffs on Canadian electronics and pharmaceuticals.
Well, when U.S. officials talk, we need to make sure that we listen.
However, even within the U.S., experts began to openly say that pressure no longer works. According to the Peterson Institute, by October 2025, about 12% of investments previously directed to North America had moved to Canadian Asian supply chains. This was an effect that no one expected. U.S. trade policy designed to strengthen the American economy, actually accelerated the outflow of capital and technology. While Washington was arguing about who was to blame for the failures of its tariff strategy, Canada was taking action. Ottawa created a special Asian Coordination Council, which included the Ministers of Finance, Energy, and Innovation. Its task is to ensure the implementation of agreements and control over investment flows. Sources say there's a joke circulating within the government. America builds walls, we build bridges.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
Behind this joke lies a sober calculation. Canada has finally decided to step out of its big brother's shadow. By the end of the year, the summit's success was evident. According to the International Monetary Fund, Canadian exports to Asia grew by more than 14%, and total investment from the region into the Canadian economy reached a record $70 billion. This is not only an economic result, but also a political signal. Asia has placed its trust in Canada. Against this backdrop, even the Financial Times wrote that for the first time in decades, Canada has ceased to be a geographical extension of the United States and has become an independent hub in the global trading system. Many commentators say that this shift was not driven by ambition, but by necessity. When the White House introduced new tariffs and markets reacted nervously to every statement made by Trump,
really build on that relationship. And I think that's why the outcome this week was a positive one. Well, we know that, no deal has been struck. We know that negotiations are going ahead in the right direction.
Canada simply could not remain dependent on such an unpredictable partner. We cannot plan for the future based on other people's tweets, said one Canadian official in a private conversation with journalists. And it seems that this has become the unspoken slogan of a new era in Canadian foreign policy. What really happened in Kuala Lumpur? Behind the applause and the protocol speeches lay something more. It was the moment when Canada realized that it was capable of acting independently. In Asia, for the first time, believed that it had a partner, not a mediator. The summit was not the end, but the beginning of a story in which Canada ceases to be America's shadow and becomes an independent force, ready to chart its own course in a world where the old centers of influence no longer guarantee stability. After the Asian summit in Kuala Lumpur, which we talked about earlier, there was a phase where diplomacy turned into specific economic actions. Canada began to implement what the Prime Minister called a new industrial strategy for the 21st century. It was based on three key areas: energy, innovation, and critical minerals. All of this was to become the foundation for transforming the country from a regional exporter of raw materials into a world-class technology player. But the main driver of this transformation was necessity.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
Pressure from U.S. tariff policy, which forced Canada to seek new markets, new alliances, and most importantly, a new economic philosophy. The first step was the creation of the Energy Horizon 2030 program. It envisaged increasing liquefied natural gas exports to 50 million tons per year and building 3 new terminals on the Pacific coast. 2 of them in British Columbia and 1 on Vancouver Island received support from investors from South Korea and Japan. For the first time in the country's history, Asian companies acquired a stake in Canadian energy projects. In exchange, Canada received a guaranteed market, long-term contracts, and infrastructure investments estimated at nearly $40 billion. However, it was not just about gas. Behind the scenes, an even more ambitious idea was being discussed: the creation of a single North Pacific energy corridor that would connect Canadian resources with Asian consumers through a network of maritime and digital hubs. According to sources in the Ministry of Energy, this idea is already being discussed with Australia and the Philippines.
And Canada's been tough on the military because they have a very low military cost.
They don't allow our banks. And you know that Canada does not allow banks to go in.
As a possible alternative to American supply routes. The second area is innovation. Canada has not traditionally been considered a leader in high technology, but in recent years, this area has become a focus of particular attention for the government. The Digital North Fund was created to focus on the development of artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and manufacturing automation. The fund's financing exceeded 20 billion Canadian dollars, part of which came from private investors in Singapore and Malaysia. These investments were not accidental. Asia needed new technology partners that were not dependent on political conflicts between the US and China. Canada, with its reputation as a neutral and predictable country, was ideal for this role. As early as 2025, a joint research center specializing in quantum cryptography technologies for energy networks began operating in Toronto. According to unofficial data, its contracts with Asian clients are estimated at more than $3 billion. But Ottawa's main trump card was critical minerals. Canada has some of the world's largest reserves of lithium, nickel, cobalt, and rare earth elements, components that are essential for the production of batteries and electronics. With the U.S. focusing on domestic production and reducing exports, Asia turned its attention to Canada. This led to the creation of the so-called Critical Minerals Alliance, which brings together Canada, Japan, South Korea, and Australia.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures.
Its creation was a geopolitical gesture directly opposed to the White House's policy. Analysts estimate that this alliance will enable Canada to increase its mineral export revenues by $120 billion over the next decade. Moreover, Ottawa is considering the possibility of creating an international exchange for critical resources headquartered in Vancouver, a move that would symbolically affirm the country's independence from the American financial system. All these measures were not just a reaction to external challenges, but part of a carefully constructed strategy. Canada understood that diplomacy alone would not win global influence. It was necessary to strengthen its economic position and create sustainable ties that could not be broken by sanctions or tariffs. That is why, in 2025, the Sovereignty Budget was adopted, a document that enshrined a sharp increase in spending on the defense industry, technology, and infrastructure. And over the course of 5 years, it was planned to triple investments in the development of artificial intelligence and double investments in battery production. But this step did not go unnoticed. European and Asian analysts called it Canada's response to the Industrial Revolution of the 21st century. Meanwhile, tensions were mounting in Washington after Donald Trump announced new tariffs on Canadian goods, from aluminum to cars. The economies of both countries felt the consequences.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
According to the Canadian Ministry of Trade, exports to the U.S. fell by 9%, but total exports to the rest of the world grew by 14%. These figures symbolized a paradox. Isolation from the U.S. did not weaken Canada, but accelerated its restructuring. Although the White House expected that pressure would force Ottawa back to the negotiating table, the opposite happened. Canada simply changed tables. In mid-2025, the Canadian authorities announced the signing of agreements with more than 20 countries in the Indo-Pacific region. These included not only major partners, such as Japan and South Korea, but also less obvious ones, such as the Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam. And these agreements covered everything from grain and mineral fertilizer supplies to cooperation in digital port management. It was this diversity that was the answer to the narrowness of the American trade model, tied to tariffs and threats. Each new agreement reduced Canada's dependence on its northern neighbor. By the end of the year, the U.S. share of Canadian exports had fallen to 68%, and a record low for the past 40 years. American economists sounded the alarm.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
The Brookings Institution published a report warning that the trade war with Canada is turning into a strategic defeat. The document stated that more than 40% of American companies working with Canadian suppliers faced increased costs and delivery delays. Against this backdrop, the U.S. industrial belt, from Michigan to Ohio, began to lose competitiveness. Car and appliance manufacturers openly stated that Trump's tariffs were hindering their business rather than protecting it. Several corporations began to move part of their operations to Canada, where export conditions had become more favorable. In Canada itself, the growing success sparked both cautious optimism and internal debate. Experts argued about whether the country could maintain its pace of expansion without losing its social balance. The central bank's reports warned of a possible overheating of the labor market and wage growth in the technology sector. But most analysts agreed that even if the pace had to be adjusted, the strategic direction was the right one. We are witnessing a moment when Canada is consciously choosing the path of independence for the first time, wrote the Globe and Mail. This is not a rebellion against America, it is coming of age. In Asia, on the contrary, Canada's entry into regional processes was perceived as a breath of fresh air. After years of Chinese dominance and Western caution, the emergence of a partner willing to act without pressure was greeted with enthusiasm. ASEAN leaders, as reported in the press, called Canada the new northern anchor. It offered not ideology, but mutual benefit. Not promises, but projects. And that is what made it possible for the country to conclude more trade agreements with Asia in 1 year than in the previous decade.